The night Inez Garrison climbed a stranger's fence to save a dying calf was the same night she decided she had nothing left to lose, and it turned out that losing everything was exactly the thing that led her straight to the one person worth finding. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the hill country of Texas, where the land rolled out like a rumpled quilt of cedar and limestone, and the nights came down fast and cold once September curled into October. The little town of Harlan's Creek sat tucked between two ridgelines, a modest collection of buildings that included a feed store, a church, a saloon that doubled as the only hotel, and a doctor's office that the doctor himself had abandoned 6 months prior when he moved his practice north to San Antonio. The people who lived in and around Harlan's Creek were the stubborn sort, the ones who had seen the posted notices about better land further west and had simply shrugged and stayed put, because they had already broken their backs building what they had, and they did not intend to abandon it. Inez Garrison was 31 years old, with dark hair the color of creek water after a storm and brown eyes that carried in them the particular kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from having survived things that broke lesser people. She had arrived in Harlan's Creek 4 years earlier as a new bride, following her husband Thomas Garrison to the 40 acres he had purchased on the strength of a letter from a land agent who described the property in considerably more generous terms than the reality warranted. Thomas had been a good man, not a sharp man, but a good one, and he had worked himself without complaint into the rocky soil of those 40 acres until the soil took something back. He had been dead 14 months when that October night arrived, carried off by a fever that started as a cough and became something terrifying inside of 2 weeks. He left Inez with the 40 acres, a small herd of cattle that had dwindled over the following year to 9 head, a gray mule named Solomon, and their son Eli, who was 7 years old and had his father's stubborn chin and his mother's watchful eyes. The 40 acres were not doing well. The truth of it was plain if you looked at the fence lines, which needed mending in 3 places Inez knew of and probably more she had not yet found. The truth of it was plain in the linta that served as her barn, where the roof leaked in 2 corners and the wood along the south wall had begun to soften with rot. She had managed the cattle herself, with Eli's help, teaching herself what Thomas had only partially learned before his death, and she had made enough of it to keep them fed and to pay the property tax that came due in the spring. But it was a constant, grinding effort, and there were nights when she lay in the narrow bed she had once shared with Thomas and felt the loneliness of it press down on her like a stone. The night in question began with a sound. Inez had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours, no more, when something pulled her up out of the dark of her dreams and deposited her back into the dark of her bedroom with her heart already moving fast in her chest. She lay still for a moment, listening. The wind was up, pushing against the cabin walls with a low, persistent moan, and the cedar outside the window scratched its branches against the glass as it always did in October. But beneath those familiar sounds was something else. A thin, high crying barely there, the kind of sound that might have been nothing, a coyote far off, a trick of the wind. But Inez had spent enough time around cattle to know the difference. She sat up, pulled her boots onto her feet over her heavy wool stockings, and took the lantern from the bedside table. The matches were in the kitchen drawer, and she moved quietly through the cabin so as not to wake Eli, who slept in the small back room with the quilt pulled up to his ears. She lit the lantern, shrugged her coat over her nightdress, and went out into the cold. The sound was clearer outside. It was coming from the northeast, from the direction of the creek that formed the boundary between her property and the property of the man who had taken over the alderman place about 8 months ago. She had seen him a handful of times from a distance, the new man at the alderman place. He was tall, she could tell that much from across a fence line, and he kept himself busy. She had watched him rebuilding the old barn single-handed over the summer, had seen the fresh white of new lumber appearing against the weathered gray of the old structure week by week. His name was Albert Slater. She knew it because the preacher's wife, Miriam Dowell, had mentioned it in passing after services one Sunday, the way people in small places always mention the new arrivals, with a mixture of curiosity and assessment. She had not spoken to him. The sound came again, thin and desperate, and Inez walked toward it with the lantern held out ahead of her. The creek was shallow this time of year, easy enough to cross on the flat stepping stones that jutted up through the water. She crossed it without getting her boots wet, which she counted as a small victory, and came up the far bank into the lower pasture of the Alderman Place, which everyone still called the Alderman Place even though Albert Slater had owned it for 8 months now. The fence was a good one, she noticed. Better than hers. Cedar posts set deep and tight, 3 strands of wire pulled taut and clean. She held the lantern up and looked along it until she found the sound, and then her breath went out of her in a rush. There was a calf down on the other side of the fence, a young one, no more than a few weeks old by the look of it, and it was flat on its side in the grass with its legs working in a slow, unfocused way that told her immediately it was in serious trouble. It had managed to push itself partially under the bottom strand of wire, and the wire had caught on the loose skin along its back, trapping it there. But the wire was not what was wrong with it. Even from the other side of the fence, she could see the labored rise and fall of its ribs, the way its head kept dropping, and then rising again with obvious effort. It was cold, it had been down long enough to get dangerously cold, and something else was wrong besides. She could see a dark wet patch on its foreleg where it must have cut itself on the wire. She looked at the fence. She looked at the calf. She set the lantern down on the ground, found the second post from where the calf lay, put her boot in the wire above the bottom strand and climbed. It was not an elegant crossing. She tore a small hole in the hem of her nightdress on the top strand and landed on the other side with less grace than she would have preferred, but she landed on her feet. She picked the lantern back up and went to the calf. It watched her approach with one large dark eye, too weak to do more than that, and she felt the familiar pull of something fierce and protective that she recognized as the same thing she felt when Eli was sick. She set the lantern in the grass and knelt beside the animal. It was a heifer calf, a little roan-colored thing with a white blaze on her face, and she was cold to the touch in a way that made Inez's stomach drop. She worked the wire loose from the calf's back carefully, bending it back so it would not catch again. The cut on the foreleg was not deep, but it was oozing steadily, and she pulled the sash from her coat and tied it above the wound, not tight enough to cut off the blood but tight enough to slow the bleeding. She needed to get the animal on its feet. She needed to get it warm. She needed to find the mother, because a calf this young and this cold needed milk badly, and she had no way of providing that herself. She looked up toward the barn, which she could just make out in the darkness at the top of the rise, a dark square shape against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. She looked down at the calf. She looked at the fence. She was going to have to go knock on Albert Slater's door. That thought sat in her chest with a particular discomfort that she recognized as pride, and she acknowledged it, and then she set it aside, because the calf needed attention and her own discomfort was not the relevant matter. She pulled off her coat and wrapped it around the calf as best she could, then stood up and walked toward the barn, which seemed the more logical first stop than the house. If the mother was anywhere, she would be there. The barn door was not latched. She pushed it open and held the lantern up, and the warm smell of animals and hay rolled out at her like a wave, and she very nearly sighed with relief just from the warmth of it. There were 4 cows in the stalls along the left side, and she walked down the row with the lantern, and in the 3rd stall she found what she was looking for. A red-end white cow, a good-sized one, who turned her head and let out a low sound that was unmistakably maternal when she saw the light. Inez stood there in the barn aisle for a moment, thinking hard. She could not carry the calf up from the pasture by herself. It was not a large calf, but she was also not a large woman, and the ground between here and there was dark and uneven. She was going to have to wake Albert Slater. She went to the house. It was a solid house, more solid than hers, though she had no interest in dwelling on that comparison. The front porch was new. She could smell the cut wood from 3 feet away, and there was a lamp burning low inside, visible through the front window, the kind of lamp that gets turned down but left lit by someone who has come inside not long before and has not yet decided they are settled for the night. She knocked on the door. There was a pause, the kind of pause that told her she had been heard, and then the sound of boots on a wooden floor, and then the door opened. Albert Slater was not what she had expected, which struck her as slightly foolish since she had not actually formed an expectation, only a vague impression from seeing a tall man across a pasture. He was 35 years old, with the kind of face that was not precisely handsome, but was the kind of face you could look at for a long time without growing tired of it. He had a jaw that could have been cut from the limestone under their feet, dark brown eyes that went from sleep-drowsy to sharp in the moment it took him to take in who was standing on his porch, and brown hair pushed sideways from the pillow. He had clearly only recently come inside because he was still fully dressed in his work clothes, his boots on, his shirt untucked in a tired sort of way with only his hat missing. He looked at her. She was standing on his porch in her coatless state, her nightdress visible below her wool skirt where the hem was torn, holding a lantern and wearing an expression that he would later describe to himself as the particular face of a woman who is absolutely prepared to solve a problem and is simply requiring assistance with one specific aspect of it. "You have a calf down in the lower pasture," Inez said. "She's cold and she's cut herself on the fence wire and she needs to be brought in. I think her mother is the red-end white in your third stall and she'll need to nurse as soon as possible. I've got the cut slowed, but you should look at it properly." Albert Slater blinked at her. Then he stepped back, took his hat from the hook by the door, put it on and said, "Show me." She showed him. He did not ask her who she was. He did not ask her how she came to be in his pasture in the middle of the night. He simply followed her down the slope with his own lantern added to hers, and when they reached the calf he crouched down beside it and ran his hands over it with a sure, calm competence that told her he knew what he was doing. He looked at the leg, untied her sash, and looked at the cut. He pressed 2 fingers against the calf's neck, feeling the pulse there. "She's cold, but her heart is steady," he said. "We can bring her through." He glanced at the coat wrapped around the calf. "That yours?" "Yes." He looked at her and seemed to notice for the first time that she was standing in the October night without a coat, and something moved across his face that might have been concern if she had been looking for it. He did not comment on it. He simply pulled the calf up into his arms, coat and all, with a practiced ease that spoke of a life lived around cattle, and nodded toward the barn. They got the calf inside and into the stall with the mother, who made an immediate and gratifying fuss over her, and Albert Slater cleaned and dressed the wound on the calf's leg with supplies from a wooden box on the barn shelf, doing it thoroughly and without any wasted motion. Inez held the lantern steady for him, and they did not talk much while the work was happening, because the work was the thing that needed attention. When it was done, and the calf was nursing with determined little pulls, while her mother stood perfectly still and patient, Albert Slater straightened up and looked at Inez properly for the first time. He was taller than she had thought, even at this distance. The lamplight made everything warm and close. "Albert Slater," he said, and held out his hand. "Inez Garrison," she said, and shook it. His hand was rough and warm, the hand of a man who worked. "I'm your neighbor to the southwest, the Garrison place." "I know it," he said. "I've seen your lights." Something about that simple statement settled into her in a way she didn't examine right then. She pulled her coat back around her shoulders, now slightly damp from the grass but still warm from the calf's body heat. "I should get back," she said. "My son is home alone." "How old?" "7," he nodded. "I'll walk you to the creek." She started to say that was not necessary, and then she did not say it, because the night was dark and it was, in fact, a more practical solution than walking back alone. She accepted it. They walked through the dark pasture with 2 lanterns between them, and the night made its ordinary sounds around them, and he walked beside her without crowding her, leaving the polite and proper distance between them that the times and the circumstances required. At the creek he held the lantern up over the stepping stones so she could see them clearly, and she crossed without trouble. She turned back to look at him from the far bank. "She'll be all right," he said. "The calf." "I know," Inez said, and almost added something more but didn't. She lifted her lantern in a small acknowledgment and turned back toward her own land. She had not slept well after that, and in the morning she had gone about her work with the memory of the previous night sitting in the back of her mind, not intrusively, just present. The way the lamplight had looked on the clean lines of his face, the gentleness with which he had handled the calf, the steadiness of him, the way he had not once made her feel foolish for climbing his fence in the middle of the night. She was not thinking about any of that in any significant way, she told herself. She was simply noting it. She was recounting it, a week later, to her closest friend, Mee Calloway, who ran the feed store with her husband Frank and who had a cheerfully merciless habit of saying exactly what she thought. They were sitting in the back room of the feed store while Eli helped Frank count seed sacks in the front, a task that Eli took extremely seriously because Frank had explained to him that it was an important job. "Albert Slater," Mee said, with the particular tone of a woman filing information away. "He was very practical about it," Inez said, which was not precisely the direction Mee was heading. "Frank says he's a good man," Mee said. "Says he came here from up near Abilene. Had some land up there that didn't work out. Lost his wife 2-3 years ago, fever." Inez set down her coffee cup. "How old was she?" 28, Mee said. "They didn't have children." Inez was quiet for a moment. There was a particular kind of fellowship she had found between people who had lost a spouse, a recognition that required no explanation. "He handled the calf very well," she said, which was not what she was thinking but was what she said. Mee looked at her with the full weight of 20 years of perspicacity and said nothing, which was somehow more communicative than if she had spoken. The next time Inez saw Albert Slater was 10 days after the night with the calf. She was mending the northeast fence line, which had been on her list for 6 weeks, and she was making poor progress because the post hole digger was behaving badly, and she had to stop every few minutes to work it loose. She was about halfway through setting a new post when she became aware of a figure at the fence line 20 yards away, and looked up to find Albert Slater on his side of the property boundary, watching her with an expression that was not quite a frown but contained a question. "Good morning," she said, and drove the post hole digger into the ground again with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. "Good morning," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "That post hole digger has a loose collar. Can I take a look at it?" She stopped and looked at the tool. He was right. There was an obvious wobble in the collar where the blade met the handle. She had been fighting that wobble for an hour and had not diagnosed it correctly. She walked to the fence line and handed it through to him, and he examined it, then reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small flathead screwdriver, which was a thing she had not known a person could carry in a shirt pocket. He tightened the collar and handed it back. "Better," she said after trying it. "It was considerably better." "You're doing this alone?" he asked, not critically, just asking. "Eli's at school," she said, "and yes, generally alone." He looked at the fence line, assessing the damage the way she had seen him assess the calf, carefully and without theater. "I have the afternoon," he said. "I could help you finish this stretch." She was going to say no. She had the words for it assembled and ready, something about managing fine and not wanting to trouble him. But then she looked at the fence line, which stretched another 60 yards and required at least 3 more new posts, and she thought about Eli coming home from school in the afternoon to find his mother still out here wrestling with the post hole digger in the cold, and she said, "If it's no trouble." "It's no trouble," he said, which was all he said. He came through the fence at the gate further down, bringing his own tools, and they worked the afternoon stretch together, and the work went considerably faster with 2 people. He was not a man who filled silences for the sake of it, she discovered, which was something she appreciated because she was also not that kind of person. And so the conversation that happened between them happened naturally, in the gaps between the work, and had the quality of conversation between people who are both more accustomed to doing than to talking. He told her about Abilene. He had had a good stretch of land up there for 4 years, he said, but the water had not cooperated, and after Clara died, he had found it difficult to be still in a place that reminded him of things, and so he had sold what he could sell and moved on. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way you report a fact about the weather. She told him about Thomas. She said Thomas had been a good man with poor luck and that she missed him, though the way she said it suggested that the sharp edge of the missing had dulled into something more like a habitual ache, the kind you work around rather than suffer through. Albert nodded and said he understood that, and she believed that he did. By the time they finished the fence line, the sun was dropping toward the western ridge and the cold was coming back with intent. They stood at the gate and he collected his tools and she held the post hole digger which now worked perfectly and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Slater." "Albert," he said, "please." "Albert," she said, "thank you." He put his hat back on. "The calf is doing well, walking without a limp." Inez smiled, and it was a real smile, the full kind rather than the small, polite kind she had been wearing since Thomas died. "That's good to hear." She watched him walk back toward his land and felt something she had not expected to feel, something that felt almost like looking forward, like the prospect of a thing rather than the aftermath of one. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it. But she thought about it that evening while she made dinner and listened to Eli talk about school with the breathless enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who had recently discovered that frogs existed and had a great many things to say about them. November arrived with a cold front that rattled the windows and put ice on the edges of the creek each morning. The work of the ranch contracted with the season, the daily duties becoming more about keeping the animals through the cold than about the broad work of the summer and fall. And Inez found herself moving through the shorter days with the particular focused energy of a person who has accepted that the season requires a different kind of effort. Albert Slater appeared at her property 3 more times in November, each time with a specific and practical reason. Once, he brought back the fence post mallet she had left on his side of the property line during the fence repair, and forgotten entirely. Once, he came to tell her that he had spotted one of her cows in the creek bottom on his side of the boundary, confused and looking for her calf, and he had walked her back to the Garrison fence line, and wanted to let Inez know in case she had not noticed the count was off. The 3rd time, he arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a section of new roofing cedar because he had driven past the lean-to and seen the damaged corner and had extra lumber from his own barn work. This last one gave Inez a moment's pause because it was a larger gesture than the others, and it required a decision about how to receive it. She received it by saying, "I'll help you put it up. I'm not going to watch you repair my roof by yourself." He looked at her for a moment, and something around his eyes changed in a way that might have been respect, might have been something warmer. "I was counting on that," he said. They put the roof section up together on a cold Wednesday, and Me Calloway's 14-year-old boy came over to help because Me had sent him specifically, with a cheerful note that said she was lending Inez's height since the corner in question required it. The work took most of the morning, and when it was done and the lean-to was sealed against the weather for the first time in months, Inez made coffee and brought it out and they stood in the yard and drank it and Me's boy drank his and ate 3 of the biscuits Inez had made, with the uncomplicated dedication to food that characterized 14-year-old boys across all eras. After he left, it was just Inez and Albert standing in the yard with their coffee, and the afternoon was beginning to pale out at the edges, and she found herself in no great hurry to go back inside. She told him that. She said, "I'm in no particular hurry if you'd like to finish your coffee." He said, "I'm not in any hurry either." They stood there for a while and talked, not about the ranch or the fence or the cattle, but about other things. He asked her about Eli, and she told him about Eli's frog obsession and his reading, which was ahead of most of the children in the school, and the way he had started trying to whistle and had not yet managed it and was deeply bothered by this. Albert laughed at that, a real laugh, and she found that she liked the sound of it, that it was an uncomplicated sound, unguarded. She asked him where he had grown up, and he told her Georgia, that he had come west at 22 with the idea of it that a lot of young men had in the years after the war, the idea that the land out here was new and unmarked by what had happened in the East, and that a man could plant himself in it without the weight of all that history pressing down. He said it had mostly worked out. He said it in a way that suggested he had made his peace with the mostly. When he finally left, riding back along the creek bottom with his coat collar turned up against the cold, Inez watched him go and acknowledged to herself, quietly and without making a large thing of it, that she was glad he was her neighbor. December came in bright and hard and cold, the kind of cold that the cedar country did in the winter, nothing like the brutal northers of the open plains, but enough to keep you inside in the evenings and to make the morning chores a test of character. The town of Harlan's Creek put up its modest Christmas preparations, which consisted mainly of a wreath on the church door and a length of red ribbon in the feed store window, and the social life of the community contracted to its winter form, which was smaller and warmer, and mostly consisted of people visiting each other by horse and sitting around stoves. The church Christmas social was on the 18th of December, a Saturday, and it was the kind of event that the town's 40-odd families attended because it was the thing to do, and because Miriam Dowell organized it with a cheerful iron will that made not attending seem like a personal affront. There was food contributed by everyone, a fire in the church's 2 stoves, and a brief theatrical performance by the school children that no one would remember in February, but that everyone would enjoy on the night. Inez came with Eli in his best clothes, which she had washed and pressed the day before, and which he had managed to keep reasonably unscathed during the walk over by simply moving very carefully, a thing he found deeply unnatural. She wore her dark blue dress, the good one, which she had last worn to Thomas's funeral, and had since altered at the waist because grief had taken some weight from her that she had not gotten back. She had put her hair up properly, and me, who arrived at the same time and gave her a look of frank assessment, said, "You look very well, Inez," with a particular emphasis on the word very that said considerably more than the words themselves. Albert Slater was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the left stove with the Dowell brothers, 2 red-faced men who raised hogs on the North Road, and he was wearing a good jacket over a clean shirt, his hat in his hand the way a man holds his hat indoors, and he had shaved. She noticed the shaving because the jaw she had become accustomed to seeing rough with a few days' growth was now clean and somewhat more revealed than usual, and it was a good jaw, she thought, and then felt somewhat foolish for thinking it. He saw her from across the room, and there was a moment, brief but real, where they simply looked at each other, and something passed between them that required no description, only acknowledgement. He came over. He said good evening to her and then crouched down and said hello to Eli, who looked at him with the frank assessment children apply to adults they have heard about but not yet met. "You're Mr. Slater," Eli said. "That's right," Albert said. "My mother helped save your calf." "She did," Albert said, and the way he said it, looking briefly up at Inez before looking back at Eli, had a warmth in it that she felt in the place below her sternum. She was the bravest person out there that night. Eli considered this and apparently found it satisfactory. "I'm Eli," he said. "I know," Albert said. "I've heard." Eli was satisfied with that too and went off to find the Calloway children, who he knew were somewhere near the food table. Inez and Albert stood together for a moment in the warm noise of the church. "You look lovely," he said, and it was not said with any performance to it, just said quietly and directly, and she felt it the way she felt the fire from the stove as an honest warmth. "Thank you," she said. You have a very fine jaw when it's not hidden." He blinked, and then he laughed, startled into it, and she laughed too, and it broke whatever slight formality had been between them and left them comfortable with each other in a way they had been approaching for weeks and had now arrived at. They sat together at supper, with Eli on Inez's other side demanding things be passed, and consuming an amount of food that was impressive for a 7-year-old. Albert passed him things without being asked, and cut the larger pieces of meat into smaller ones when Eli's fork was struggling, doing it so naturally that Inez had to look away for a moment at the wall to collect herself. After supper, when the children did their performance, a somewhat chaotic retelling of the Christmas story that involved one child forgetting his lines entirely, and another ad-libbing so enthusiastically that the shepherds ended up delivering a small sermon about the importance of good fencing, which made the adults laugh helplessly while Miriam Dowell put her hand over her face. Inez and Albert stood at the back of the church, and she found herself pressed slightly closer to him in the crowd than the distance they had kept before, and neither of them moved away. When the evening ended and the families began gathering their coats and children, Albert walked Inez and Eli back to her place, which was on his way regardless, but which she understood was also simply something he wanted to do. Eli walked between them and fell asleep standing against Albert's leg at one point while Albert was talking, and Albert caught him without breaking his sentence, settled the boy's weight against his side, and kept walking and talking as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing, which to him it apparently was. Inez looked at the side of his face in the dark and felt something shift in her chest, a large, slow movement, like a door on a heavy hinge, opening. At her door, Albert transferred the sleeping Eli to her arms, and the boy stirred briefly and then settled again with his face against her shoulder, and Albert stood on the porch and said, "Good night, Inez," and she said, "Good night, Albert," and they looked at each other for a moment in the cold and the quiet, and then she went inside. She stood in the dark of the front room for a moment with Eli's weight warm and heavy in her arms, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who has been honest with herself long enough to recognize the signs, that she was falling in love with Albert Slater. She put Eli to bed, came back to the front room, sat down in the chair by the stove, and sat with that knowledge for a while. It was not a frightening knowledge which surprised her. It was a frightening thing to lose what you had built with Thomas, and it had been a frightening thing to rebuild herself alone after. But this particular feeling was not frightening. It felt more like something returning than something new, like a sense she had thought was gone coming back. She went to bed in a better state of mind than she had been in for a long time. January was cold and honest and kept them both occupied, and the feeling between them deepened in the way that feelings do when two people are too busy to be self-conscious about them. Albert came around twice a week with practical excuses, and she invited him for supper on Sundays after church, and they sat at her table and ate and talked while Eli interrogated Albert about every aspect of cattle ranching, and Albert answered every question with complete seriousness, which Eli appreciated enormously. There was a Sunday in late January when they were washing up after supper, Inez at the wash basin and Albert drying, a division of labor they had arrived at naturally, and Eli was asleep in the back room, and the stove made its small ticking sounds, and they were talking about nothing in particular, about the price of hay and whether the spring was going to be early or late, and Albert put down the dried plate and turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was so open, so undefended, that she went still. "I should tell you something," he said. She turned from the basin to face him. "I think about you a good deal," he said. "More than is probably appropriate for a neighbor. I want you to know that because I think you should know it, and because I am not a man who is comfortable letting things go unsaid that should be said." She dried her hands on the dishcloth and looked at him carefully. He held her gaze without looking away, which was a kind of courage, she thought. "I think about you too," she said. "More than is appropriate, probably since that night with the fence." Something in his face changed completely, a release of something held, a relaxation into relief and warmth. He took a half step toward her, not closing the distance between them but acknowledging it. "I want to do this properly," he said. "I want to court you properly if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He smiled then, the full version, and she thought that for a jaw as composed as his, the smile did remarkable things to it. "Then I'd like to call on you formally," he said. "Sunday afternoons, if that suits." "Sunday afternoons suit me very well," she said. He left shortly after, and Inez stood on the porch and watched him ride home in the cold moonlight, and she went back inside feeling warm from somewhere deep. The courtship was conducted with the propriety that the times and both their natures required, and with a warmth that grew steadily underneath that propriety, like a fire banked but not smothered. He called on her Sunday afternoons as agreed, and sometimes on a Saturday when the week's work permitted, and they rode out along the creek together when the weather allowed and sat by the fire inside when it didn't, and Eli was very often with them, which Albert did not treat as a complication but as a simple fact, taking the boy with equal seriousness and affection in all things. In February, he brought her a book from the traveling bookseller who came through Harlan's Creek twice a year, a novel she had mentioned wanting to read in passing one Sunday, mentioned it so briefly she had not thought he would remember it. He had remembered it. He gave it to her without ceremony, without making a large thing of it, just set it on the table and said he had thought she might like it, and the simplicity of it, the fact of him having listened and remembered and acted on it, meant considerably more to her than any elaborate gesture could have. There was a February afternoon when they were riding back along the ridge above the creek and the winter light lay low and golden across the cedar, the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting of itself, and she said, "Do you think you'll stay in Harlan's Creek?" And he turned to look at her with a steadiness that she had come to think of as characteristic of him, the way he looked at things he had already considered. "I think I've already decided I'm staying," he said, and he was looking at her when he said it, not at the landscape, and she understood what he meant, and felt the warmth of it move through her. Me Calloway, with the satisfaction of a woman who has observed a thing developing and finds herself proven correct, said in March, "He's very gone on you, Inez. Frank says he's never seen a man ride past an opportunity to go in the direction of a particular piece of property the way Albert Slater does." Inez laughed at that, a real laugh. "Frank ought to mind his own fences," she said. "He does," me said cheerfully. "And then he watches your neighbor ride past them at a regular interval. It's become a reliable entertainment." Spring came in with all the force it typically brought to the cedar country, green grass appearing on the hillsides with the shocking suddenness of a color being applied to a gray picture, the creek running high and fast with the rain that came in March. The work expanded again with the season, calving and planting and mending and burning of the last year's growth, and they were both busy in the way of spring. But the Sunday afternoons continued, and the Saturday visits when they could manage them, and in April on a Saturday afternoon when Eli was at the Callaways and they were sitting on her porch in the mild sun, Albert Slater looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup and said, "I'd like to marry you, Inez, if you'd have me." She looked at him. "You and Eli," he said. "I mean both of you, and I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to choose between your son and a husband. That's not a choice anyone should have to make." She felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "Albert, I know it has not been a very long time," he said. "I know you had a life before this and that I am not him and I don't intend to be him. I intend to be me. But I love you and I think you know that, and I'd rather say it plainly than leave it hanging in the air between us." She set her coffee cup down on the porch rail and turned fully toward him. "It has been almost 6 months," she said. "And I have learned more about the quality of a man in 6 months of knowing you than I sometimes felt I knew about Thomas in 4 years. I know you. I know the kind of man you are. And yes, my answer is yes." He reached over and took her hand, and held it with a gentleness that was also firm. The way he held things he did not intend to let go of, and she held his hand back, and they sat on the porch in the April sun with that between them, settled and certain. They told Eli that evening when he came home from the Callaways with a grass stain on his knee and a frog in his coat pocket, the latter of which he revealed only after some initial evasion. They sat him down in the front room, and Inez explained, carefully and clearly, that Albert was going to become part of their family, that he was going to marry Inez and come to live with them, and that Eli could ask any question he had and they would answer it honestly. Eli looked at Albert for a long, measuring moment. "Will I call you Papa?" he said. Albert looked at him with the same steadiness he brought to everything and said, "You can call me whatever feels right to you, Eli. There's no wrong answer. What matters is that I'm here." Eli thought about this with visible concentration. "I think I'll try Papa," he said, "and see how it feels." "That sounds like a reasonable plan," Albert said, and Eli apparently agreed, because he nodded and then asked if he could keep the frog overnight, which was a separate negotiation that Inez conducted with the weary expertise of a woman who had been through this conversation several times before, and which ended with the frog going into a jar on the porch and being released in the morning. They married in May, on a warm Saturday morning at the Harlan's Creek Church, with Miriam Dowell officiating the arrangements as she arranged everything in town, with cheerful thoroughness. Me stood with Inez, and Frank stood with Albert, and Eli stood beside both of them at the front of the church with an expression of extreme dignity that he had been practicing for 2 weeks. Inez wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, and she came down the aisle of the small church on no one's arm, because she was a woman who had walked herself through the last 14 months, and she intended to walk herself down this aisle as well. But she walked toward Albert, who was standing at the front with his hands behind his back and his hat off and his jacket perfectly straight, and who watched her come toward him with an expression that was so undisguised that me Calloway, standing to the side, had to press her lips together to keep from smiling too broadly. The words were said. The ring was placed. Inez looked up at Albert and he looked down at her, and Eli, standing between them and slightly ahead, turned to look at both of them with a grin that he had been saving for this exact moment. The full, perfect, uncomplicated grin of a child who has understood that something good is happening and is entirely in favor of it. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that people in the Cedar Country talked about for years afterward, mild and well-watered, the grass deep and the cattle fat, the kind of summer that looked like a promise being kept. Albert moved his things to the Garrison place, the larger structure, and they discussed what to do with his property across the creek. The land was good and the barn was sound, and he proposed that they run both operations together, expanding the herd and using the pasture on both sides of the creek. It was a practical suggestion with a substantial logic to it, and Inez sat with the maps and the numbers for 2 evenings and came back to him with modifications to the plan that he studied carefully and then agreed were better than his original version. "You are better at this than I am," he said, not with any particular surprise, just as a recognition of a fact. "I had to learn it alone," she said. "Alone teaches you to pay attention." "It does," he said, and there was something in how he said it that acknowledged his own alone time, the Abilene years, and she reached over and put her hand briefly on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and that was that. They were a good team, and the word team was the right word for what they were, because there was an equality to it, a shared weight that Inez had not had before and that she valued with a fierceness that surprised even her. Albert did not manage her. He did not override her. He talked things through with her, lay out his reasoning, listened to hers, and they reached decisions together, and she found that to be an extraordinary thing, more extraordinary than she had expected because she had not known to expect it. In the evenings, when Eli was in bed, they sat together on the porch in the warm dark and talked, or didn't talk, in the easy way of 2 people who have reached the stage of being genuinely comfortable with each other's silence. He would read sometimes and she would sew, and the lamp between them lit both their faces. And she would look over at him at some point in the evening, at the particular angle of his head when he was concentrating, at the way he occasionally moved his lips slightly when he encountered a passage he found striking, and she would feel the deep, settled warmth of it of him, and think that she had been lucky, that she had been extraordinarily, undeservedly lucky, and that she was grateful every day for a small roan calf who had gotten herself tangled in a fence on a cold October night. In September, a year after the night she had climbed his fence, she told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the morning before the day's work started, and his face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid she could barely track them: surprise, and then something wide open and amazed, and then a kind of joy that she had not seen in him before, something younger than his usual steadiness, something unprepared. He said, "Inez." Just that, just her name, and then he pulled her to him and held her with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she felt his heart beating hard against her chest, and she held him back and felt the fullness of it, the complete, overwhelming fullness of what had been built here from a fence and a dying calf and a cold night. Eli took the news with his characteristic pragmatism. He asked if the baby would be a boy or a girl, was told they would not know until it arrived, considered this and said, "I suppose either way it could still learn to whistle," which was the skill he had recently, triumphantly, finally managed, and which he now considered a fundamental human achievement. The Dowells were pleased. Me and Frank were delighted. The general opinion of Harlan's Creek, which had been following the progress of this particular development with the attentive interest that small towns always had in the romantic arrangements of their residents, was that this was exactly as it should be, and several people who had not previously expressed any opinion about Albert Slater felt sufficiently moved to tell Inez that she had chosen well, which she received with grace and only slight amusement at how certain everyone was that she had done the choosing. She had done the choosing, of course. She would have been the first to say so. She had chosen to climb that fence. She had chosen to knock on that door. She had chosen to accept his help with the fence line and to drink coffee in the yard and to say yes on the porch in April. She had chosen him, the same way he had chosen her, and the equal nature of that choosing was one of the things she loved most about all of it. The fall of 1879 was busy and good, the cattle in fine condition, the expanded operation running smoothly, the cabin expanded with a new room that Albert had built over the summer, working in the evenings after the day's other work was done, a proper second bedroom for Eli and a larger front room, and she had watched the room go up board by board over those weeks and had felt a particular pride in it, in the thing they were building together that was larger than either of them alone. There was a difficulty in October, a situation that required attention and that tested both of them. A man named Cortlandt Perry, who owned a large spread north of town, had been running fence lines that encroached on several of the smaller properties along his southern boundary, and he had enough money and enough social confidence to make this encroachment feel like a done deal to the people it affected. 2 families had already accepted his offered price and moved on. A third family, the Vasquez family, who had ranched their land for 20 years, who had been there before Perry arrived and before half the other settlers, found themselves facing the same pressure, and it was a more pointed pressure in their case, delivered with the particular edge of the times and the region and what Cortlandt Perry thought about who had a right to own what. Albert heard about it from Frank Calloway and came home that evening with a tightness around his jaw that Inez recognized as contained anger. He told her about it at supper and she listened, and then she said, "What are we going to do about it?" He looked at her. "I was thinking we'd go to the county seat," he said. "Get the deed records, get the survey information, and then put that in front of Perry in a way that makes it clear that what he's doing is not going to stand without a legal fight." "I'll come with you," she said. He looked at her again and nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." They went to the county seat on a Thursday in October, leaving Eli with me, and they sat in the county clerk's office for 3 hours going through deed records and survey plats, and what they found was clear. The Vasquez land was properly filed, properly surveyed, properly held, and Perry's new fence was unambiguously on land that did not belong to him. They got certified copies of the relevant records, and they went to see a lawyer named Hendricks who practiced out of the county seat and who looked at the documents and said the case was straightforward. They went home, and the following Saturday they went to see Luis Vasquez, who was a quiet man of 50 with graying hair and a direct gaze, and his wife Maria, who offered them coffee and watched them with a careful wariness that Inez understood, the wariness of people who have been promised things before. Albert laid out the records on the kitchen table and explained what they showed and what the lawyer had said. Luis Vasquez studied the documents for a long time without speaking. "We can go with you to the lawyer if you'd like," Inez said, "and we can stand beside you when you put this in front of Perry. There are other people in the county who don't like what he's been doing. I think he would find, if it came to it, that he has less support than he believes." Maria Vasquez looked at Inez with an expression that softened from wariness into something more open. Luis looked up from the documents. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Albert said, "Because it's the right thing." The right thing took 2 more weeks and involved a conversation with Perry himself, which Albert conducted with a cold, precise civility that was more effective than any anger could have been, and which ended with Perry's new fence being moved back to its legal boundary. The Vasquez family kept their land. Maria Vasquez came to the Slater place 3 weeks later with a pie and a length of hand-embroidered cloth, and she and Inez sat together in the front room and talked for 2 hours, and it was the beginning of a friendship that lasted decades. The baby arrived in March of 1880, at the very beginning of spring, as if he had decided to come with the green grass and the high creek. He was a healthy boy, born in the early morning with me as the attending midwife, after a long night that Albert spent entirely in the cabin, not sleeping, not pretending he was going to sleep, moving between the kitchen where he heated water and the doorway of the bedroom where he could hear Inez and me and could gauge from the sounds how things were going. When me finally came out of the bedroom and told him to come in, he went in, and there was Inez, exhausted and present in the way of someone who has just done something requiring every particle of themselves, and in her arms was a red, newborn, absolutely perfect son. Inez looked up at Albert and there were tears running down her face, the good kind, and she said, "Come here." And he sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at his son and felt something that he had no words for, something that exceeded language entirely. "He needs a name," she said. They had discussed names. They had discussed many names. In the end they had agreed on Thomas Albert. Thomas for the man who had come before and who had been a good man and who deserved to be remembered. Albert for the man who was here now. And the two together in one small person felt right to both of them, felt like a continuity rather than a replacement. Eli met his brother the following morning, coming into the bedroom with his boots on the wrong feet in his excitement, and he stood beside the bed and looked at Thomas Albert with an expression of absolute concentration, as if he were memorizing him. "He's very small," Eli said. "He'll grow," Inez said. "I know," Eli said. "I'm small in all my memories too." He looked up at Albert, who was standing at the head of the bed. "Papa, will you teach him to whistle when he's big enough?" "I'll teach you both things when he's big enough," Albert said. "There's a lot to teach." Eli considered this and nodded with the gravity of a person who has accepted an important responsibility. "I'll help," he said. The spring and summer of 1880 were the fullest Inez had known since before Thomas died, and she knew as she moved through them that she was in the middle of the good part, not looking back at it or forward to it, but actually inside it, which was the rare and precious thing. Thomas Albert grew with the single-minded enthusiasm that healthy babies bring to the project of becoming larger, and Eli took his role as older brother with a seriousness that was sometimes touching and occasionally overzealous. as when he attempted to explain to his 2-month-old brother the finer points of frog biology. Albert watched this with visible amusement and the particular warmth of a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it. There was a morning in late July, one of those mornings when the whole world smells like grass and warm cedar, and the sky is the particular deep blue that belongs to Texas summers. When Inez was standing at the pasture fence, watching the cattle graze, and Albert came and stood beside her, and they looked out together at the land that was both of theirs now, the 40 acres she had held through the hard year, and the 80 acres he had brought across the creek. 120 acres running together along the creek bottom and up into the cedar hills, with the cattle fat and the fences tight and the barn solid. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood like that for a while, just standing. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me that morning, at dawn, after we'd gotten the calf settled?" "I said you could stay," he said, "if you wanted." She had been about to go. She had done the work the calf was nursing. The sun was coming up at the edge of the pasture, and she had turned to go back over the fence and back to her own land. And he had been standing in the barn doorway watching the sky lighten, and he had said it in a quiet, almost offhand way that she had not known how to interpret at the time. "You can stay," just that. She had not stayed that morning. She had said she had to get back. She had gone back over the fence and back to her cabin and her sleeping son, and she had thought about those words off and on for weeks. "I didn't know what you meant," she said, "that morning." "I know," he said. "I barely knew what I meant. I just knew I didn't want you to go yet." She tilted her head to look up at him. "And now?" He looked down at her, and the morning light was on his face, and he looked like a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive, settled and present and entirely sure. "Now I mean it permanently," he said. She smiled and turned back to the pasture. "I stayed," she said. "You did," he said. The roan calf, who had grown into a fine young heifer over the previous 2 years, was in the near pasture, and she raised her head from the grass at that moment and looked at them with the mild, incurious gaze of a cow who has no idea she was the beginning of anything. Eli, who had been behind them without either of them noticing, came up and ducked under the fence rail to get a better view of something in the creek bed, and Albert caught the back of his collar before he toppled over the edge. Eli said, "I saw a very large frog," in a tone suggesting this justified the risk, and Albert said, "All frogs look larger from a distance." And Eli said, "This one was genuinely large," and they argued this with great enthusiasm all the way back to the house for breakfast. In the house, Thomas Albert was awake in his cradle and making the determined small sounds of a person with strong opinions about being hungry, and Inez picked him up and held him, and he quieted immediately, gripping her finger with his whole fist. She sat in the chair by the window with the morning light coming in, and Albert brought her coffee and set it on the table beside her, and she looked up at him with the full, unhurried love of someone who has stopped being surprised by happiness and has simply accepted it as the ordinary fabric of the day. The autumn of 1880 brought changes to Harlan's Creek as it brought changes everywhere in the West. The railroad had been moving steadily through the region, and the nearest line was now only 20 miles to the south, which brought new people and new commerce, and the town began to grow in small but visible ways. A new doctor arrived in September, a young man from Ohio named Dr. Paul Whitmore, who was 26 years old and had come west with the specific intention of practicing in a rural community where he was genuinely needed. Miriam Dowell organized his welcome with her usual efficiency, and he was installed in the old doctor's office within 2 weeks, and the community, which had been managing its medical needs with varying degrees of improvisation for the better part of a year, was visibly relieved. Albert, who had been quietly managing a strained shoulder from a fence post-incident that summer, was the doctor's 3rd patient, and came home reporting that the young man seemed to know what he was doing, which from Albert was high praise. Inez went to see him the following week for the routine care that was appropriate with Thomas Albert still young, and found him to be thorough and professional, and thought that the community was fortunate. November brought the anniversary of the night Inez had climbed the fence, and she found herself thinking about it on the day, not with the muted ache of a hard time remembered, but with something like wonder, like holding an ordinary rock and realizing it contained something precious. 1 year before, she had been a widow in a cold field trying to save something small and helpless, because it was the right thing to do, and she did not know how to do anything else. She had not known Albert Slater existed in any meaningful way. She had not known that any of this was ahead of her. She told Albert that evening, after Eli was in bed and Thomas Albert was asleep in his cradle, what she had been thinking about. She told him about the specific quality of that October night, the cold of it, the loneliness she had been carrying without fully acknowledging, the way the calf's thin crying had pulled her out of her bed and across the creek into a stranger's pasture as if by a thread. "I was not looking for anything," she said. "I want you to know that. I was not hoping for anything. I was just trying to save the calf." "I know," he said. He was sitting beside her on the settee they had acquired over the summer, and he turned toward her with his arm behind her. "I wasn't looking either. I'd made my peace with not finding anything." "And then," she said, "and then there you were," he said simply, "standing on my porch in your nightdress in the cold, telling me about my own calf in a tone that suggested you had already solved the problem and just needed my hands." She laughed at that. "I did have a plan." "You always have a plan," he said, and there was nothing but admiration in it. She leaned into him and he held her, and outside the wind moved through the cedar trees with its familiar voice, and inside the fire made its small, persistent sounds, and Thomas Albert breathed the slow breath of a sleeping infant, and it was complete, all of it, a life, built out of necessity and chance and a cold night and a roan calf and two people who had both, separately and at great cost, learned what was worth holding on to. The Christmas of 1880 was the fullest Inez had known since she was a girl. They went to the church social again, the Slater family this time, the four of them, Albert and Inez and Eli and Thomas Albert, who was bundled so thoroughly for the cold night that only his eyes were visible, and who regarded the bright lights of the church with the focused astonishment of a baby encountering something marvelous. Eli had grown 2 inches and had opinions about everything, and was currently engaged in teaching himself to play the harmonica, a project that was appreciated in theory and somewhat taxing in practice. Albert had bought the harmonica himself, and Inez had given him a look about it, and he had said with perfect innocence that it seemed like a useful skill for a boy to have, and she had said, "You are going to regret that by February," and he had said, "Probably," and they had both been right. The new year of 1881 came in clear and cold and full of the ordinary, extraordinary richness that a life well-built contains. The cattle herd was at its strongest count since either of them had started ranching in the county. The fences were all sound. The barn was solid. The house was warm. Eli was excelling at school and had developed, over the winter, a sincere and passionate interest in the mathematics that his teacher said showed real aptitude. Thomas Albert had begun to pull himself upright on every available surface, which was the first phase of walking, and which required a new level of attention from everyone in the household, including Eli, who took his supervisory role with such dedication that he sometimes had to be reminded to go outside and play. Albert and Luis Vasquez had developed a genuine friendship over the months since the fence dispute, built on the shared work of neighboring ranches and the mutual respect of two men who recognized quality in each other. They traded labor during the busy seasons, the kind of arrangement that the ranching community ran on, and their families ate together on Sunday evenings with some regularity. Maria Vasquez and Inez had become close in the way of women who have recognized each other as people of substance, and their conversations ranged freely across everything from the management of cattle to the raising of children to the particular challenges and injustices that both women, in their different circumstances, had navigated and continued to navigate in a time and place that was not always generous to those who did not fit its dominant shape. Inez appreciated those conversations. She had found, in the 4 years of being alone after Thomas died, that honesty was something she valued above almost all other qualities, and Maria Vasquez was honest in the direct, unsentimental way of someone who has had to be. They understood each other. Spring of 1881 came early, as Albert had predicted it would, reading the signs in the winter weather with the accuracy of a man who had been watching the sky for 15 years. The creek ran high and fast in March, and the grass came in deep and green, and Thomas Albert, 10 months old, took his first steps across the kitchen floor toward Inez with an expression of absolute concentration, and landed against her legs with a pleased thump that made everyone present, which was Eli and Albert and Inez herself, exclaim simultaneously. Albert picked the baby up and held him at arm's length and looked at him with the particular expression that Inez had come to love most on his face, the one where all his composure gave way to simple, unguarded joy, and he said, "There you are," the way he had said it to Inez once, on a porch in April 2 years ago, meaning both times the same essential thing, which was that the person he was looking at was exactly where they ought to be. Eli said, "I walked at 9 months," with the mild competitiveness of an older sibling, and Albert said, without looking away from Thomas Albert, "You did. You walked straight into the kitchen table and there was a bump the size of a walnut," and Inez said, "He had that bump for 2 weeks," and Eli said, "I don't remember that," and Albert said, "You wouldn't, you were 9 months old," and they all laughed in the comfortable, layered way of a family that has built a shared history and is still building it. Later that evening, when both children were asleep and the house was quiet, Inez and Albert sat on the porch in the warm spring dark. The creek was audible from where they sat, which it always was when running high, a constant low music. The stars were out in their full Texas abundance, thrown across the sky with the kind of lavishness that suggested the sky was showing off. "I want to ask you something," Albert said. "Ask," she said. "Are you happy, truly happy? Not content, not managing, not making the best of things. Happy." She looked at him, at the particular way the darkness and the porch lamp combined on his face, the jaw and the dark eyes and the quiet steadiness of him. This man she had not known existed 18 months ago and could now not imagine the world without. "Yes," she said, "truly happy. The kind that doesn't have a next thing after it, no waiting for the other shoe. Just happy." He nodded, and there was a slowness to it, a settling, as if something that had been held open in him had gently, finally closed. "Me too," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers, and they sat there together in the spring dark with the creek running and the stars out and the children asleep inside, and the life they had made spread out around them, growing and real and entirely their own. The summer of 1881 brought with it the kind of work that 2 ranches running together generated, full and demanding and satisfying, and it brought also a visitor. Albert's younger brother, James Slater, came down from Abilene in July, having heard from a mutual contact that Albert had married and settled, and wanting to see it for himself. James was 30 years old, pleasant-faced and talkative in a way that was the opposite of his brother's quiet, and he arrived with a good horse and a pack full of questions, and stayed for 2 weeks. He was clearly both pleased and slightly amazed by what he found. He told Inez on the second day, in the kitchen while Albert was out doing the morning chores, that he had been worried about his brother after Clara, that Albert had gone very quiet in a way that James had not known how to reach. He said he was glad. He said it simply and with obvious sincerity, and Inez received it the same way. "He worried about you too," she said. "In the Abilene years. He didn't say so in those words, but I know it." James looked at her with appreciation. "You know him well," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do." Eli took to James immediately and followed him around with the devoted intensity of a boy who has one father figure and is pleasantly surprised to find there is a bonus uncle included. James proved himself to the Slater household by knowing 3 more harmonica songs than Eli did, which elevated his status considerably. Albert watched this with a warmth he made no effort to conceal. When James left, he shook Albert's hand and then pulled him into an embrace that Albert received somewhat stiffly, and then returned. And Inez watched from the porch and thought about the particular way that brothers love each other, practical, and not often spoken and therefore all the more real. He waved to her from his horse and told her she was welcome in Abilene any time, and she said she might just take him up on that, and he rode away along the north road, and Albert came back up the porch steps and stood beside her and watched the dust of his horse settle. "It was good to see him," Albert said. "Yes," she said. "It was." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she put hers around his waist, and they went back inside to the life they were building, which was large and ongoing and full of the ordinary daily elements that are, in sum, everything. October came around again, the 3rd October of their acquaintance, the 2nd of their marriage. The mornings were cold and clear, the cedars unchanged because they never changed, and the cattle were being moved to the lower pastures. Inez and Albert worked the cattle together, which they often did, riding the pastures in the early morning with the light coming low and gold across the hills, and Eli rode with them on his pony, a small paint horse he had named Admiral, because he had been reading about the Navy and felt the name suited a horse of character. On the morning of the 20th of October, Inez rode up to the ridge above the creek bottom and stopped her horse and looked south toward the place where her land and Albert's land met and became one thing, and she felt the fullness of the moment settle over her like the light. Albert came up beside her and stopped his horse and looked out at what she was looking at. "1 year ago," she said, "to about this week." He knew what she meant. He always knew. 2 years, he said. 2 years ago next week. She nodded. 2 years since the calf. 2 years since the fence. 2 years since she had stood at the creek in the dark with a dying animal and a neighbor she did not know, and neither of them had known where any of it would lead. "If the calf had been fine," she said, "if she had not gotten herself tangled, we would not have known each other." "I think we would have found a way," Albert said. He was looking not at the landscape but at her, and his face held the certainty of a man who has thought about this. "I think we were going to find our way to each other regardless. The calf was just the door." She looked at him. "The door, yes, that was the right word for it. A cold night," she said, "a fence, a dying calf. And a woman who climbed the fence," he said. "That was the important part." She smiled at him, the full smile. "Someone had to." He leaned over from his saddle, which was awkward from horseback, but he managed it, and kissed her, briefly and properly, and she laughed against his mouth. And Admiral made a small, disgruntled sound at the disruption, and Eli, who had come up behind them, said, "You are both being extremely undignified," in a tone of complete authority. "You are absolutely right," Albert said, straightening up with a composure that was only slightly undermined by the smile he could not suppress. "I learned it from you," Inez told Eli, which was not entirely a lie. They rode down from the ridge together, the 3 of them, back toward the house where Thomas Albert was with Maria Vasquez, who had come over to help with the morning. The cattle moved below them on the flat, the herd fat and sound, and the creek caught the morning light and threw it back. And the cedars smelled the way they always smelled, clean and sharp, and like the specific, particular smell of this piece of earth that was theirs. The life continued. It continued in the way of good lives, with work and seasons and the children growing, and the ranch expanding slowly in the way of solid things built carefully over time. Thomas Albert was walking everywhere by the following spring and talking by the summer, with a vocabulary that he wielded with gusto, and a stubborn streak that Albert said was entirely from Inez's side, and that Inez pointed out was exactly Albert's jaw translated into personality. By the spring of 1883, When Thomas Albert was 3 and Eli was 11, and Admiral the paint horse had developed an opinion about Gates, they were joined by another child, a daughter this time, who arrived in April with dark hair like her mother's and the same brown eyes, and who was named Clara Rose. Clara for the woman Albert had loved and lost and who deserved to be remembered. Rose because Inez had always loved roses, and they were difficult to grow in the cedar country, and she intended to plant them anyway. Eli, who had been an only child for 7 years before Thomas Albert's arrival and had adapted to brotherhood with considerable grace, received the news of a sister with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has understood that family is something that grows. "Girls are difficult," he said, with the confidence of 11. "So are boys," Albert said. "Believe me, I know." Clara Rose proved to be neither difficult nor simple, but entirely herself from the first week. An alert, watchful baby who seemed to be taking in everything and storing it for later, which was, Mee Calloway said when she came to see her, exactly her mother. Albert held his daughter the way he had held his son, at arm's length, looking at her with that particular unguarded face, and said something quietly that Inez, standing close, heard as a kind of promise, low-voiced and complete, and she felt the tears come up behind her eyes the way they did whenever she let herself fully see what had been built here, the full scope of it, from a cold night and a fence and 2 people who had both been alone and were no longer. In the years that followed, the Slater Ranch became what solid, well-run ranches in good country become, a known thing, a reliable thing, a part of the landscape in the way that matters more than size or spectacle. Albert was known in the county as a fair dealer and a good neighbor, a man whose word meant exactly what he said it meant. Inez was known as the woman who had held the Garrison place together alone for over a year, and had done it better than most men would have, and who ran the combined operation with a practical intelligence that other ranchers, when they were being honest, envied without reservation. Their friendship with the Vasquez family deepened into one of those friendships that become, over years, indistinguishable from family. Lewis and Albert ranched together through several difficult seasons with the mutual support that made the difference between managing and not. Maria and Inez talked and worked and helped each other through the things that the frontier asked of women, which were considerable, and the friendship between them was one of the steadfast things in both their lives. Eli grew up tall and thoughtful, with his mother's watching eyes and his father's unhurried steadiness, and he went to study in San Antonio at 17, carrying with him a letter of recommendation from his school teacher that said his aptitude for mathematics was exceptional. He came home in the summers and worked the ranch with Albert with a competence that Albert watched with the particular pride of a man who has watched something grow from the beginning. The question of what to call Albert had resolved itself years before into Papa, said naturally and without qualifier, because that was what he was. Thomas Albert grew into himself at his own pace, different from his brother in temperament but no less himself for it, with a quick, humorous quality that he had got from somewhere in between both parents, and that made him easy company. He learned to whistle very early, which delighted Eli enormously, as if the young skill he had been the first to master had been passed on correctly. Clara Rose, who had been watching and storing since birth, turned out to be the sharpest of the 3, with a mind that cut to the center of things with a directness that occasionally startled people who had expected otherwise. She rode before she talked in full sentences, which Albert always said was a proper order of priorities, and she had her mother's absolute refusal to be managed or overlooked. On a September evening in 1890, 10 years after Thomas Albert had taken his first steps across the kitchen floor, Inez and Albert sat on the porch the way they had sat on 100 September evenings. The ranch was quiet in the end-of-day way, the cattle settled, the horses in the pasture, the light going long and amber across the hills. Inside, Clara Rose was reading to Thomas Albert, who tolerated this with the patience of a 9-year-old who loves his sister and finds her choices in literature questionable. Eli was still in San Antonio, would be home for Christmas. Albert had his coffee and Inez had hers, and the evening was that particular temperature of early fall that is the best temperature in the world, warm enough to be comfortable and cool enough to feel the change coming, the year turning toward its rest. "Are you glad?" Inez said. He looked at her. "That I climbed your fence," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way he had looked at her on that first morning at the barn door with the light coming up, when she had been about to go and he had said she could stay, with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he valued. "I am glad," he said, "every single day." She reached for his hand, and he gave it, and they held on to each other the way they had learned to hold on to the things that mattered, with care and with intent, and with the solid, practiced certainty of two people who know the value of what they have and do not take a moment of it for granted. The creek ran on below the pasture. The cedars held the last light. Inside, Clara Rose's reading voice rose and fell, and Thomas Albert made a comment, and she made a counter-comment, and the sound of it, ordinary and alive in theirs, came out through the open window and filled the evening air around them with all the warm, enduring, completely ordinary miracle of a life that has found its right shape. They stayed there together on the porch as the night came down, not moving, not needing to, held in the good and permanent warmth of everything they had built, and everything they were, and everything that continued still ahead of them, as long and promising and full of grace as the land that stretched out around them under the wide, unhurried Texas sky.